It's wonderful to virtually see all of you. By way of introduction, I'm Rabbi Steven Gotlib. I've given a few shiurim for Torah in Motion, and I think at least some of you were at my shiurim when I was in Toronto, part of BMZD, at Beit Mordechai Dov under Rabbi Furchiner. But by way of introduction, I am Rabbi Steven Gotlib. I'm currently the associate rabbi at Mikor HaBaracha Center City Synagogue in Philadelphia. This is my daughter Zariza, who will be giving the shir tonight. I spent several years up in Canada. I was the assistant rabbi at the village shul while I was learning under Rabbi Turchiner, and then I was the interim rabbi for a year at the Young Israel of Ottawa right after that, which was a very fascinating experience. So this little one is actually a Canadian citizen herself. And so, I feel very well connected to the Torah in Motion and the Greater Toronto community, especially. So it's always a pleasure to be back virtually reconnecting with this community. Now, as some might have heard, this is a pinch hitting session on the shiur. There was originally someone else who was scheduled, and I got a text this morning from Rabbi Kelman saying, "Are you available to give a shiur tonight?" Myself and some others, and I said, "Sure." So here we are. Luckily, this is a topic that I'm well rehearsed in. I actually just gave it as an extended shiur as my Parsha shir in Shul last Shabbos. So we have a 2-for-1 because it works for this week and it also works for last week. So if we make it all the way to the end, I'll share how it also works for last week, and then you'll be a step ahead for Parshat Baaloscha next year, in addition to Parshat Shlach this year. And I want to note from the outset, when you see the source sheet that I'm going to be using, there's a lot of text on it. The text is mainly used for reference so that you can see what it is that I am referring to. And on your own time after the shiur, if you want to read through it a little bit more in depth, you will have it. I'm not planning on going through every single source word for word. It would take quite a long time, but I want to be able to touch on some of these ideas that are in the contemporary scholarship, is as you'll see a bit of a in quotations word to use on the subject.
Do you have a
But
doll I could borrow?
pardon, pardon, sorry. But I want us to be able to see, what was said on the particular subject. So I'm going to put a link in the chat for the Google document that I'm going to be using and referring to throughout this. And you can open it if you want to. I'm not going to share the screen just because I want this to be really more discussion based than anything else. And we're going to start obviously rooted into this week's Parsha, where we have what is really one of the earliest examples of the good old Jewish propensity to complain. I'll just read it in English to save time. The whole community broke into loud cries, and the people wept that night. All the Israelites railed against Moshe and Aaron. If only we had died in the land of Egypt. And here, where they're complaining, I always like to imagine in the Mel Brooks heckler voice. If only we had died in the land of Egypt. The whole community shouted at them. Or if only we might die in this wilderness. Why is Hashem taking us to that land to fall by the sword? Our wives and children to be carried off. It would be better for us to go back to Egypt. And they said to one another, "Let us head back to Egypt." They're all talking, saying, "Let's go back. Let's just go back." And Moshe and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembled congregation of Israelites. And Yoshua ben Nun and Caleb ben Yefuneh, for those who had scouted the land, rent their clothes. And then obviously we know, oh, little one. And then obviously we know that Caleb and Yoshua go on to present a very strong defense of the land, a defense that ultimately wins the day, Baruch Hashem. But it wasn't for lack of the people really complaining very, very, very strongly. And I want to open with this, if only to demonstrate from a Torah perspective, the idea that Jews can complain and say, "What do we need this Israel for?" went way back. Now, that doesn't excuse it. It is very clearly presented as an objective negative, something that is so incorrect and so morally wrong, and we're going to get into that a little bit, that how can a Jew in good standing have that position? That's the presentation of the Torah at the very least. However, it is also an attitude that continues to this very day, and that we really see, particularly in certain subsets of academia, but we really see throughout the Jewish world, especially amongst younger demographics. I know when I was in Ottawa during October 7th, like even then we had seen members of the community who were, starting to embrace those kinds of positions, and it was quite troubling for many. But I want to examine this as a phenomenon, and I want to use that to ask, how can we, as a collective Jewish people, move forward on this in a productive way? And I want to do that in conversation with several sources and books that were put out fairly recently. The brunt of this, at least here, coming from two particular books that are both very recent, within the past year or two, and all of the books that are listed here have actually been in the past, within the past year or two. I don't think anything is more than 2 years old here. So one that we see that also shows just how old this phenomenon is a work that was recently published by Dr. Malka Simkovich. She is currently the editor-in-chief of JPS, the Jewish Publication Society. She was previously the head of, I want to say, Jewish Catholic Studies at a Catholic university in the Chicago area, if I'm remembering correctly. And she wrote a book entitled Letters from Home, The Creation of Diaspora in Jewish Antiquity. And it really goes only through older sources, only through sources from the Babylonian exile during the Second Temple period, to show how Jews who had chosen to remain in Babylon, in particular, Egypt, communities like that, how they continued to interact with the community that was in the land of Israel, that returned there and rebuilt the temple. So I'll just read a little bit from this first paragraph that she puts there, and then I'll summarize the rest. So this is source number 2. Only a few generations ago, it was commonplace for scholars to dismiss diasporic Jewish life as marginal to the authentic Jewish experiences that took place in the land of Israel. I think that's how most people even today see it. Israel is kind of the main setting of the Jewish story, so to speak. And us outside in diaspora, exile, whatever word we want to use, are kind of side characters to the main story of the Jewish people. I don't think that that's a theological controversial thing to say. However, Dr. Simkovich points out that there are studies that are being done now that are trying to change that narrative that we're going to get into. She says, underlying this scholarship was the presumption that Jews living outside the land of Israel were collectively guilty of sin, suffering consequent estrangement from their God, etc., etc. Now, this is something that actually does continue in contemporary Jewish life. We see many, particularly Dati Leumi poskim in Israel, saying, it's a sin to live outside of Israel and all of these things. I won't be commenting on that in this shiur, but there is certainly a mode of rabbinic thought that continues to exist today that does, call us out for not being in Israel right now, and it's important to acknowledge that. She continues, from a demographic perspective, life outside Israel was a massive success. After the deportations to Babylonia in 597 to 586 BCE, most of the Judahites, which is how we're referring to the ancient Jews, and their descendants lived outside the land of Israel, where they established robust communities, right? We have to understand that in all of the cases of exile and return, most of the Jews chose not to go back to the land of Israel and continue their comfortable lives in the diasporic community that they found themselves in. In fact, even if we go back to the very first of those, even if we go back to Egypt, we have to remember many of the Jews chose not to leave Egypt. The ones who did leave were not a particularly large group, at least according to much of our midrashic tradition. So this is really something that has been part of the Jewish people from the beginning. So the fact that many chose to stay and continue to choose to stay in more exiles. Even now, less than half of the world's population lives in Israel. When half of us or more do live in Israel, we'll be in an interesting position halachically with many issues. Again, not a sheer for now, but something that's worth calling attention to. And this is really something that we can trace back. It is not a new phenomenon, despite the fact that it takes slightly different forms each time that it happens. And we'll keep that in mind as we continuing with Dr. Simch's words. Even after Persian authorities vanquished Babylon and granted Judahites permission to return to their homeland around 583, most of them decided to remain outside of their homeland. Over time, they scattered throughout the Persian world. Some settled locally in communities along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Others moved west to regions lying along the Mediterranean Levant. Despite literary and material evidence suggesting that the descendants of these Judahites embraced their ancestral identities regardless of where they lived, meaning they stayed Jewish, scholars of early Judaism working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries focused primarily on the literatures produced in the land of Israel to answer the question of how the Judaism of early Second Temple transitions into the Judaism of the Second Temple era, which the early rabbis inherited. So this is a phenomenon that we see within scholarship that Dr. Simchish is calling attention to, which is that even though most Jews lived outside of Israel, and even though most of those Jews retained, at least the ones that we have writing of, which we need to acknowledge is a minority, those are the ones who are literate enough to leave behind writings and wealthy enough to leave behind writings, and they seem to maintain their Jewish tradition and their Jewish identity. Nonetheless, the trend of scholarship was always to emphasize the Jewish story in Israel as being the core, which in some sense should be unsurprising. But I want to quote a scholar who is saying that and really tracing the scholarship on this. She continues, over the past century, the discovery and publication of additional Jewish texts from the Second Temple era has prompted scholars to reassess prevailing assumptions about the early Jewish self-understanding in the diaspora. So now we see the situation is not as simple as we thought. The varied outlooks expressed in this literature testify to the countless ways Jews outside the land of Israel creatively assimilated cultures, etc., etc. Basically, she's saying there was a robust Jewish identity outside, and she especially calls attention to the fact that many scholars who are writing that are now overcorrecting. That you see a trend, particularly amongst historians, to say now, well, maybe Israel wasn't so important that diaspora was really the place to be. And she herself says both of those perspectives are wrong. Israel and the diaspora communities always existed side by side, always had their own narratives that were responding to each other consciously, but neither should be seen as the be-all and end-all to the exclusion of the other. It is just as bad for scholars to say the diaspora is where everyone should be focusing on as the main characters, as it is to erase it and pretend that it did not exist. I'm going to skip after these ellipses to demonstrate that a little bit. To the last paragraph here before source number 3. Still, it is clear that Jews in both regions felt deeply connected to one another, even if they perceived their relationship differently. They expressed support for one another's political and social well-being and practiced their ancestral laws in similar ways, right? There was more that connected them than separated them. The factor that singularly differentiated them was their attitude towards the concept of diaspora. Most Jews hoped for a time when all people would live in harmonious coexistence, when foreign nations would embrace the Jewish people, recognize their God, that means Hashem, capital G, and when Jews would embrace one another in common worship. For Judean Jews, that is those who were living in the land of Israel, the image of this common worship was shaped by scriptural depictions of Jews returning from exile to worship alongside one another at the Jerusalem temple. So this should be unsurprising to us because we do daven 3 times a day, that the exiles will return to Israel and be part of the Jewish community. I don't know how this baby just fell asleep on me while I'm talking this loud, but I'll take it. So we have this idea that the Jews are going to return. And that is the story within Israel that is being told. That is what the documentation shows. And that is the theology that survived today into the Sidurim that we daven from 3 times a day. For Jews in Egypt, however, that is those who were still in exile at the time and did not choose to go back, it rested on the critical role that Jews outside the land of Israel would play in bringing the knowledge of the one true God to foreign nations. So those who stayed in exile did not see themselves as being in a position of secondary status. They did not see themselves as being in sin for not living in Israel. They saw themselves as having a different purpose. They saw themselves as fulfilling a different mission, a mission that was still important in its own way. They were effectively shlichim, representing Judaism to the world. And they did not see an inherent problem in that. And that, I want to argue, is one of the two biggest differences between the Israel diaspora relationship in ancient times and the predicament that we currently see ourselves in as a Jewish people. Difference number one is that nowadays, the common belief, including amongst those outside of the land of Israel, is that we should be in the land of Israel. And even if we should not be in the land of Israel, we should support Israel, whether that means financially, whether that means as advocates politically, whether that means making sure to visit frequently, whether that means encouraging others to make aliyah, whatever the case may be. The common, and dare I say, the mainstream approach by several kilometers is that we should be in Israel and supporting Israel very strongly. That was not the case, at least based on the documentary evidence that we have, of this earlier Israel diaspora relationship. A second difference that we see is that the relationship is today not complementary, but is antagonistic. That nowadays we have a not insignificant subset of Jews who not only say it's good to live in exile, but say that it is good to live in exile and we should not be living in Israel. Or if we are, we should not be living in a state in Israel. And that changes the dynamic significantly and leaves us in modern times with a very important question, which is the question of how do we then relate? If it's not only that, if we're going back to the biblical complaint, saying it's better for us to be in Egypt and die in Egypt, we might as well go back, we shouldn't be here at all, that's very different than saying, live and let live, you do your thing there, we'll do our things here. And we need to grapple with that. And the next two sources here are sources that I put in specifically to trigger those of us who are on this shiur. I'm going to read them, and I'm going to read them so that we can actually see their words and grapple with it, because these are not only public individuals, and they are public individuals, but they represent a not insignificant number of young, largely American progressive Jews. And these positions are not going away. We are going to hear them within the Jewish community, not necessarily as strongly in Toronto or Ottawa, where the Zionist community is much, much, much firmer. But certainly I can say here in Philadelphia, in New York, in LA, in the American communities, we are seeing it more and more and more. And the question shifts from, it is still chaval, but the question shifts from how do we get this out to how do we respond, because we're hearing it enough that we know that it's not going to be disappearing. And so I'm going to read both sources 3 and 4 out loud, just so we can hear this perspective and understand that it is a perspective that exists and one that is getting louder, not softer. So number three is from Professor Shaul Magid, currently of Harvard Divinity School, in the book that he wrote this past year called The Necessity of Exile. And by the name of the book, we should already get an idea of where he's going in it. And this is from one of his opening, sorry, not his opening argument. This is from in the middle of his book. I used it as an opening quote in a review that I wrote of the book to kind of get the idea across. This is what we're dealing with. He says as follows: Jews under the age of 50 do not know Israel as anything other than an occupying power. And with the advent of the internet, English-speaking Jews can read Jerusalem Post alongside Al Jazeera, The Forward alongside The Guardian. In such an open access environment, Israel's propaganda industry is failing miserably. It has some talented people, but it simply doesn't stand a chance against the present media ecosystem or against the complex reality that is Israel-Palestine, now being reported on by diverse voices within that ecosystem. And the reality is grim. The half-century occupation has arguably become de facto annexation. The prospects for a two-state solution are at their nadir. Many younger Jews, often progressive in politics and questioning after their own Jewish spiritual identity, find that a presumption of reflexive support for Israel as an occupying power insults their conscience and their intelligence, urging someone committed to liberal or progressive politics to support an illiberal state just because it happens to be Israel, parentheses, an argument that gestures toward a kind of Jewish exceptionalism, will not bear much fruit in my view. Now, this is actually one of the most tame paragraphs in his entire book. He identifies himself as being a counter-Zionist, meaning he's not only anti-Zionist, he doesn't want Zionism to remain a word at all in the Jewish lexicon. He thinks it's served its time and it's done and we need to throw it out. He thinks that Israel should be a state that is not necessarily Jewish in character. He has a lot of very extreme arguments in his book. But I think the point he's making here is quite true. Not true in the sense of it's a good argument to make, true in the sense that there are many young progressive Jews who share this view. And that is something that we as a community need to acknowledge, and we need to deal with, and we need to respond to, not something that we can ignore and kick under the rug. And that is an uncomfortable thing to say, especially to an audience of what I imagine are at least a few very committed Zionists. But it is something that we are hearing more and more on the ground. And it is really, not going away anytime soon, seemingly. The next source number 4, is equally triggering, I think. And it comes from the introduction to Peter Beinart's book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. Once again, the name of the book should explain basically what he thinks. But I want to share this paragraph just to really hammer in. This is a belief that people really have and hold very strongly. He writes, he is writing to quote unquote mainstream Zionists. I consider your single-minded focus on Israeli security to be immoral and self-defeating. It justifies actions I consider war crimes. It blinds you to the essential interconnectedness of Jewish and Palestinian safety. When I hear you thunder about Israelis murdered and captured on October 7th, I wish you would summon some of that righteous anger for the Palestinians slaughtered in even greater numbers. That's why I titled the book Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, not Being Jewish After October 7th. It's not because I minimize that day. I remain shaken in terror. I chose the former as a title because I know you grapple with the terror of that day. I worry that you don't grapple significantly with the terror of the days that followed and preceded it as well. And I want to emphasize that preceded it part because he does lay out in the book what he thinks were causes for October 7th, basically blaming the state of Israel for it. Unsurprising, but this is something that I want to share because it is not only these two extreme individuals who say this. There is a large, growing group of progressive Jews in their 20s, 30s who believe this and want to be part of the Jewish community while believing this. And it leads to a very important question that we, members of the mainstream Zionist Jewish community, need to ask ourselves of how do we respond to that? Not how do we keep this under the rug, not how do we pretend it doesn't exist, but how do we offer a response that can hopefully bring them back into the fold, or if not, that can, at least be listened to as a response and not just talking over one another. And that's where source number 5 comes in. This was a recent book that I read called Zionism and Emotional State. Great title for a book. It's by Professor Derek Penslar. He is I want to say, chair of Jewish studies at Harvard nowadays. Relevant for this conversation is that he spent the vast majority of his academic career at the University of Toronto. And I think that his approach to Zionism is actually colored by that. I'm actually working on an article currently on differences between American and Canadian approaches to Judaism in general and Zionism in particular. And an argument that I'm putting forward in that is that the Zionism that we see in the large Canadian communities, by which, let's say, Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, Vancouver, etc., is much more of a emotional, visceral Zionism than what we see in the US, which is a little bit more of like a cultural, like grew up with it sense of Zionism. I think there are a lot of reasons for that that are sociological, that we can get into where the sociology sheer. But for now, I don't think we need to go so much on. So first of all, he acknowledges, this is in source number 5, for Jews who choose to identify as Zionists, Zionism connotes liberation and redemption. The world perpetuates venerable Jewish self-conceptions of uniqueness and vulnerability while striving for collective security and integration into the community of nations. It is also a signifier of potent feelings that vary enormously, depending on who employs the word and how it is used. Right? When I say I am a Zionist, that does not automatically mean the same thing as any other person in this group chat. It might, but it might not. We don't really have an easy way of knowing that because the word, at the very least, means I support Jews living in our ancestral homeland securely. But beyond that, it can mean any number of things, ranging from, to use two extremes, ranging from a two-state solution kind of approach to an approach of Kahanism and anything in between. And those can all be considered Zionist. So, it's not obvious what someone means when they say, I am a Zionist. Now, what Penslar does in his book, which I think is very helpful, is that he goes through and identifies 8 contemporary uses of the word. Now, he is clear not everyone fits purely into one or the other. People often are a combination of multiple of these, but he thinks that these are the 8 categories of what the word Zionism means nowadays based on how people use it. And I want to go through all 8 of these conceptions because I think each of them has a place. Now, what unites all of these is, again, belief that the Jewish people should be able to live in the land of Israel safely and securely, being autonomous within it. From there are many, many, many different definitions of it, and here we're going to go through them. Number 1 that he lays out is philanthropic Zionism, which he defines as a compassionate attachment to Jews who seek refuge to dwell in the land of Israel, expressed primarily through donating money, fundraising, or providing social services on a voluntary basis. So, I don't live in Israel, but I give a lot of money to those who are, currently making Aliyah to, Israel as a country so that it can develop itself. And I'm buying a lot of Israel bonds, a lot of those, trees in the wherever, we've all heard of these approaches. So we have these kinds of things that are going on. I apologize. There's a phone ringing on the other side of the room. But we have these kinds of approaches that are happening through that. I should note Rav Melamed, in an essay that he wrote on the mitzvah of making Aliyah, says if you don't make Aliyah, but you are donating money to the land of Israel, then you have a shutfus with the mitzvah of it. You're sharing in the mitzvah of living in Israel, even if you're not fulfilling it fully. That's something to keep in mind. He still says we should fulfill it fully. And he actually even has a tiered system of, he says it's better to make Aliyah to Yehuda v'Shomron than it is to make Aliyah to Yerushalayim, because everyone's living in Yerushalayim already, and you should be settling the land, not just moving to a place where everyone's already living. Interesting thing, again, for a different shiur. But philanthropic Zionism is certainly Zionism in good standing. It's not saying you're not a Zionist. It's saying I am expressing my Zionism. Excuse me. I am expressing my Zionism via supporting those who are making Aliyah right now while waiting to do it myself. Number two is Hebraic Zionism, which is Hebrew language and culture being at the center, devotion to the language and its development and dissemination, and belief that the flourishing of Hebrew and the revival of the Jewish community in Israel are mutually dependent. Meaning, I want there to be a shared universal Jewish culture and values and language such that I, here in Philadelphia, can communicate with Jews wherever they are, whether they're in Toronto, whether Toronto's a bad example, whether they're in Quebec City, whether they're in Brussels, whether they're in Helsinki, whether they're in Japan, we can communicate in a universal language and have a universal shared culture. That is something that is possible when you have a state of Israel, but that is not something that is possible when we are when we do not have that kind of system. Number three is statist Zionism, which is the one that we will be most familiar with, which is saying there must be a Jewish state, that it is not enough for us to be able to live securely and safely in the land. We need to have a government, we need to have an army, we need to have, all these things like any other nation state has. And if we don't have that, then, we might be able to live in the land of Israel, but it's not doing us all that great. Now, originally, that did not mean being in Israel. As I'm sure many of us know, there was originally an idea of being in Uganda that Herzl at least didn't initially veto. But it means we should have a state and government, et cetera, et cetera. Number four is catastrophic Zionism, which is an extension of that, saying that we will only be safe if we have a state. Meaning it's not enough that we should have a state. The reason we should have a state is so that we will never be in a situation where, God forbid, something like the Holocaust can happen again. We will never be weak. We will never be in a position where we can be bullied and tossed around like we were. We're in a different state of mind. We're in a different reality. Which leads to number five, transformative Zionism. That the age of the weak Jew hunched over the books with glasses and scrawny figure is over. We need to completely transform ourselves. And that can only happen when we have a successful country in which we live that is our own. We can realize what it means to be Jews as a Jewish people, not as Jews who are living under the shadow of other peoples. Number six is ethnic Zionism. That's seeing Israel more as a cultural symbol and collective identity, as opposed to seeing it as sacred or as a historic homeland and the like. Number seven is sacral Zionism, which includes religious Zionism within it, particularly the brand of saying I'm going to be a halachic Jew and living in Israel, and that means certain things different than it means living in America, but also messianic Zionism, that Zionism is an expression of the Messianic age coming into fruition. And then finally, number eight, Judaic Zionism, where Zionism and Judaism are part and parcel with each other, where my Zionism is an expression of my Judaism is an expression of my Zionism. Everything that is within the state of Israel is holy. Everything in it should be supported and celebrated. And that is how I view my identity. Now, he says at the end of the book, all these definitions of Zionism are, legitimate uses of it. People mean any of them. They are not all the same. They're very different from one another. Someone who's a Hebraic Zionist is very different than a Judaic Zionist. Someone who's a statist Zionist is very different from someone who's an ethical Zionist, an ethnic Zionist, I should say. Yet, we are all using the word. And I think it does ring true that if we're in Shul any given week, we are going to see people who are there who are using the word differently than we do. Now, I should note, none of those are anti-Zionists. Those are all different uses of a Zionism that does unapologetically support the right of the Jewish people to live in Israel with safety and solidarity in a way that is autonomous, in a way that does not have to worry about any imminent threats to survival and to thriving. That is a basis for all of those versions of Zionism. And the approach of anti-Zionism falls beyond any of those definitions. And so the question becomes, what do we do within that? I imagine even on this call, some probably resonate more with some of those definitions of Zionism than others. I know even I myself resonate with some of those more than others. The question is not which of those 8 is the proper one. We can argue about that all day, and we should, because it's important to argue. We're Jews, we argue by definition. But we should not be blinded by the fact that there is a greater battle to be fought. There is a greater context in which we are in that we have to respond to and be part of. And that is where last week's Parsha comes in addition to this week's Parsha. This week's Parsha has the Jewish people complaining, saying, let's go back to Egypt. Why do we need this holy land? Why do we need this promised land? We can just go back to Egypt. At least we had our food prepared for us. At least we didn't have to worry about starving and dying. You know, we'd be slaves, but so what? It'd be better than risking our lives for this homeland that we've never seen yet. That was in this week's Parsha. Last week's Parsha opened with the menorah, and the light of the menorah. And there's an opening line, the opening line of last week's Parsha, that the light of the menorah was facing the center. And there's a comment by Sforno on that pasuk. And he says that the right and the left came together to create a brighter center shining outwards from the menorah. And, Sforno extends that to saying that, one side was worldly endeavors, one side was spiritual endeavors, the two come together. It's a great kind of proto-source for Torah Umada and modern Orthodoxy. But where I went in my halacha shir last week was, what if we just take it at face value for a second? Right and left come together and create a brighter center. What does that mean? Within Zionism, we have liberal Zionists, we have more right-wing, hawkish, insert word here, Zionists. We have everyone in between. If we stop fighting with each other and say we're all on the same side as Zionists, defending the right unapologetically of the Jewish people to live in Israel in safety and security during this time, we really embrace the idea of unity as part of that menorah together, we'll be able to shine a brighter light against those who are really against us, against those who are really on the other side. And they are there. And if we shine a bright enough light, and we show that there's enough variance within what we believe, there's enough room, at least some of those who are effectively kids who don't know much better are going to be illuminated and see that there's room for them to come back and be part of the community. Now, what happens to be, and here I'll share a practical. So Philadelphia is an interesting community in that regard. We're a very, very, very progressive city, probably one of the most progressive cities in America. And as a result of that, there's a lot of tensions around this issue. But we haven't seen these tensions in my shul. The reason for that is because everyone in the city understands that at my shul, we are a religious Zionist institution. We have an Israeli flag right next to the Aron. Every week, collectively, everyone out loud says the prayer for the state of Israel. Every week, we are singing Achenu together. Almost every other person in shul is wearing either a hostage necklace or a ribbon. It is obvious what we stand for and what we believe in, and we are unapologetic about it. It doesn't matter what view you have when you walk in. When you are in our space, you are in solidarity with us and with the Jewish people as a whole. But people also know there's another modern Orthodox shul in South Philadelphia that does not take a stance. As far as I know, they don't say a particularly robust prayer for Israel. They say, I think, a shortened version of it. And they have outspoken anti-Zionists who are part of their community over there. And so what you see in Philadelphia is a really interesting divide where people who are otherwise progressive, and by that I mean any permutation of queer LGBTQIA plus, any permutation of, voted for Bernie back in the day or whoever, um, no matter who they are politically, if they're Zionists, or if they want to caucus with Zionists, so to speak, they know to come to us. And if they're not, they know there's another place that they could go to. And what that puts us in is an interesting situation where a lot of people who are on the fence end up switching off between both communities because they don't have a strong position one way or the other. And that means that there's a responsibility of us to say, there's room within the Zionist story for you. The question is, how do we view ourselves on that? Are we willing to say, you can just go to the other place, we don't need to hear any of your doubts or criticisms? Or can we say, you are welcome here to explore and to have dialogue in good conscience? I want to emphasize those last three words, in good faith, in good conscience, and say that there's room for that. And my argument, which might, I hope is not controversial, but might be controversial, is that we should have space for those conversations. When it's happening in good faith, when it's coming from a place of genuine curiosity and innocence and not knowing better, why is that different from someone who isn't keeping Shabbos? Why is it different from someone who is not fully observant yet? Same type of thing as far as I'm concerned. And I think that we're a better community for having those conversations and allowing those conversations to be had. Now, what that does not mean is saying no holds barred. We would never, as a community, stop identifying as Zionists to appease people. We would never stop saying a prayer for Israel to appease people. We would never stop saying a Misha Barak for Tzahal, who desperately need it right now, because people don't like it. We would never have any of those concessions. We know what we believe, we know who we are, and we're proud of it. But we're willing to let others in the door and have those conversations. And I think that's something that I'm seeing fewer and fewer shoals and rabbis and lay leaders be willing to engage in. And I think that that's sad because there are people who could otherwise embrace Zionism again. Again, whether liberal Zionism or more centrist Zionism or more right-wing Zionism, that's more of a personal political question. But some form of genuine Zionism and appreciation. And in this day and age, we're seeing a lot less of that. So I want to just close with that image in our mind again of the menorah, right and left coming together, shining brighter as a result of that. Are we prepared to put in the work to shine brightly? Or are we willing to sacrifice one side for the other? On that note, I'll open things for questions, comments. I'm prepared for tomatoes to be thrown at me. I'm ready to duck. But I wanted to at least raise what I think is an important conversation to be had. Anyone who wants to can just, if you want to put something in chat, you can put it in the chat. If you want to just unmute, you can unmute. But hopefully there are thoughts.
I think that those people that you quote in sources 3 and 4 are not interested in dialogue with Zionists. They've made
sure.
up their mind. What they're writing about, they staunchly believe in that, and they don't want to hear an argument about Zionism. So
absolutely.
you're laying the blame on Zionists, and I don't know if that's fair.
Yeah, so I would just say on that. So I included those sources as an example of the extreme positions that are beyond the pale, but of what they're saying. I didn't include those as saying these are the people we should be engaging with. The people we should be engaging with are the people who are, let's say, on the fence, who are being exposed to those positions, and who might have those positions in some vague sense of, it's what they're told and what they're seeing, but it's not necessarily something that they're holding hard and fast to. The conversation with the people themselves is I can tell you from experience because at least Professor Magid and I have gone back and forth several times. That is, I think, a fruitless conversation. I wouldn't say fully fruitless actually. I would say for people who are watching that conversation, it could have an impact on them deciding where they want to go. But certainly, I wouldn't assume that I would change the minds of a Shaul Magid or a Peter Beinart. I don't think that anyone should be trying to. They are certainly, holding very fast to those beliefs. But I think the people who are on the center, who are hearing both perspectives, they're the ones that we should be having those conversations with. Does that make sense?
Thank you for an excellent presentation. I'm from Toronto, so perhaps I'm more emotional about this, but I don't regard Zionism as equivalent to sort of a shade of Judaism, like level of observance.
Okay.
I see it as more primal because when we talk about levels of observance, the gradations can be quite fine and almost infinite, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, that's all. I see it as sort of a different domain.
Oh, yeah. I think there is something to be said on that. I do think that there is genuinely something to the specifically Canadian Torontonian approach to Zionism that is unique in that regard. I think some of that has to do with the fact that I've written elsewhere on the way that Canadian culture is different, particularly than American culture when it comes to ethnicities across the board. I think there's also something to that. The Canadian community is a younger community that is more connected to both the Holocaust and to the land of Israel on average than the
That's
American
true.
community.
Yeah.
That I should say than the community in the States. I think there are a lot of factors that go into that, but I think you're absolutely right. It's something that is much more of a primal, emotional. This is a core part of my identity that is staying with me, regardless of where I'm falling on other religio-political positions.
Yeah.
And I think that that's actually something that we in the States should be learning from and should be appreciating. Because I think that that's an approach that is really very, very, very important.
I look
Um,
forward to your paper.
Pardon?
I look forward to your paper.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to finishing writing it. Any other questions, comments, critique? Always happy to hear critique. Alrighty, well, thank you all so much. I apologize again that this was a rather last-minute presentation on the subject, but it's always a pleasure to teach for Torah in Motion, and I hope that at the very least we're thinking a little bit deeper about these questions and where we fit, so that at the very least we can come out as stronger, more articulate Zionists in the face of a zeitgeist that is not exactly on our side. At the very least, we should know this is what I believe, this is what I stand for, and I'm going to face what is around me bravely and strongly, knowing that I have the weight of my people behind me from the very beginning until now, and knowing that I am engaging in something that my ancestors engaged in, and that I am, proudly on the right side of. So thank you all so much. I'm happy to stick around if anyone does have any questions.
Yeah,
Um,
I would like to just point out to you something which I'm sure you know already, that Malka Simkovich pointed out that in Dvarim, the Septuagint translated the word Za'ava as horror, as something horrible. So we already have a horror of the diaspora in the time of the Septuagint.
yes, indeed.
This was the subject of a paper that she wrote in the Jewish Review of Books.
Yes, indeed. I wasn't familiar with that particular paper, but I do see the connection very strongly. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you. But it's a very good talk that you gave.
It was
I
great.
appreciate it. I hope so. Alrighty. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Cool, Chief.
Good night.